Hey everybody, hope that everyone's doing well. And in this video, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to do a little bit of a reflection on our first module. I think it's important to take the time, even though it can be challenging because usually after writing a revised draft and going through the whole process of a module, writing an essay, our energy is a little bit low, or our brain is a little bit exhausted and overstretched. But I think it's always a good thing to go back and reflect a little bit on the process, so as to give yourself a little bit of sort of secondary thinking or a little bit of perspective about the whole writing process and what worked well and what didn't. So we'll do that a little bit, and then the primary goal here is to introduce our second module. Of course, it's called Iconoclast, and we are focusing in on people who often challenge the status quo or challenge the norms of society in a way that has an important or valuable or productive social impact. It could also be a social impact that is controversial as well. So it's not like it has to be all valuable and productive and everything's peaches and cream. It could be having some sort of impact on society that is controversial or even damaging. So those are things we will think about in terms of the iconoclast. So to start, I'm going to share my screen as usual here and start off. Give me one second. Start off with, here we go. Always takes me a second. Sorry about that. And start off with this process of reflection regarding our first module. So sort of before we say goodbye, uh, let's think about doing an M1 process reflection. Now, you're not required to turn this in. It's really up to you whether or not you want to do this. Again, this is just another writing strategy that I recommend in terms of really developing your writing skills and developing your writing process. And by writing process, I don't mean just writing the RD1 or the WD1. Right? I mean, a writing process involves all kinds of things leading up to the process of actually sitting down and writing a draft. We talked about the difference between writing a workshop draft as opposed to writing a revised draft. With revision, we're doing something quite different. We're not sort of, spilling ideas onto the page, if you will, as we are usually in a workshop draft, but we're actually going back and seeing how we can reorganize and build upon those ideas, refine those ideas, clarify those ideas. In the same way, when we're doing the discussion boards like we're doing now, like we just did for our second module, that's a whole part of the writing process, right? How I do my research, how I even spend my time thinking about my ideas, right? I have a tendency to often think about what I'm working on as I'm, riding on trains, or, when I have a moment sort of to myself, I have a tendency to sort of think about whatever it is I'm working on. And I think that's a very important part of my process. In fact, it's a time in which I take notes and do stuff like that. So that all said, the idea here is to not just reflect on what it was like to write the draft, though those are, or the two drafts, but those things are important. But the idea here is to also think about the ways in which um, the process as a whole is something that we can sort of learn from our experience of going through it. So the idea here is to write a brief process narrative. Like I said, you're not required to turn this in. This is just a recommended strategy. Um, and the idea would be to sort of, maybe just write a paragraph or two using a narrative style description, write out the process through which you wrote your essay, right? I started out by building upon our second discussion, then I did an element analytical point list, etc. And some of the things you can consider as you write this sort of brief process narrative are, what was the sort of order of your process? Did you, what was the first thing you did? What did you do next? What did you do after that? And try to just quickly describe the order of your work. And this is so you can sort of visualize for yourself what are the steps that you go through. Now, a lot of times these things can be unconscious, right? We've learned tips and tricks about writing from previous, writing experiences or previous writing classes or previous writing professors or mentors. We're learning some new tips and tricks in the class that we're in now. So the idea, but a lot of times those things kind of go unconscious, and then we sometimes get set in our ways, right? It's like, well, I always do this. Well, maybe that thing that you always do isn't as productive as it could be. So maybe there's a way in which we could think about, we could change that. But the idea of this then that thing is just to sort of surface and realize and just sort of write out briefly, quickly, what is the order of things that you do. And then sort of pay attention to what I call flights and falls, which is like, what are the things that you did that really worked well, right? Where were the moments that you really felt like, oh, I did this brainstorming activity, or I really felt like the subclaim activity helped a lot, or, you know, you know, I really felt like, taking a break from writing, right? Which is part of my writing process, actually. I know it's not like we always have a whole bunch of time, but I often feel like if I'm getting overwhelmed with my work, I'm getting sort of, anxious or stressed out. It's good for me to sort of step outside, take a walk, breathe a little, give a little space to it. And then, of course, thinking about where you struggled, what are the things that really, maybe you waited too long. I kind of put it off until the last day. I mean, we're all sort of strapped for time with all of our responsibilities and all our schoolwork and all of our work responsibilities and our families. But maybe there's things you could do to sort of make sure that you're not leaving it to the last minute or the last couple hours, right? Or maybe there's things I could do. Really, maybe I want to put that much more research in early, right? I actually want to do research into whatever it is I'm writing about earlier on, and that way I can have that material already in hand instead of doing it the last second. So, what are the places that you struggled, and being aware of those things, and that will help you perhaps think about the ways in which you can sort of work through those more effectively. Another thing to think about is what interactions helped you. What are the ways, and by interactions, I mean things that you either communicated with other people, like your peers. Did you have a conversation with your peer? Did you call one of your classmates? Did you talk to your friends? Did you have a conversation with me? Any of the peer feedback or the instructor feedback you received, or even just things like in terms of you going to, like maybe you used the Genius website and started to build on some of those ideas, or how did you do your research, again, in terms of a notion of interacting with outside material or with others as a way to help you through. Um, and then I think a fascinating thing to do is think about, if you had another day, what would you do? Right? If you had another day to work on the RD1, what were the things that you would really pay attention to? Or if you had another day, let's say, to sort of go back and change something in terms of your writing process, what would that be? One of the things that is a sort of anecdote related to this is when I was in undergrad, like you guys, uh, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. came and spoke to our school. Kurt Vonnegut Jr. is a famous novelist who wrote things like Cat's Cradle and other books. I can't even think of them on the top of my head, but Hocus Pocus is another one. Um, he, anyways, a wonderful sort of powerful sort of author of novels. And he came and spoke to our undergrad class. And one of the things he said, and this was kind of surprising coming from such an accomplished writer, is that he never felt like he was done with any of his novels. Now, obviously, he's writing novels. We're not writing novels, but I think the same applies to any writing circumstance often, which is that it's never going to feel perfect. It's never going to feel like you're completely done. It'll probably always feel like there's something more that you could do, if you just had a little bit more time. And so, in many cases, what Kurt Vonnegut Jr. said is he had to sort of break up, right? He had to sort of just separate himself from the work and say, okay, this is the best I can do right now. This is the best I can do with what I got. This is the best I can do in the scenario. So there we go. So I think that's valuable advice. It's sort of it's humbling in the sense that or it's humanizing is what it is, in terms of giving us a sense like, yeah, it's never going to, you're probably always going to feel like there's more you could do and that it could be that much better. And that's okay, right? And we've got to move on, we've got to go to the next thing, into the next project. So the goal here is, when by reflecting on these things, and these are things that you can put in the conversation below in terms of the discussion, is what are some of the tips and tricks that you used to help yourself along? Do you have things, and they could be silly things like, oh, I always make sure that I drink 2 cups of coffee before I write, or you know what, I actually go to I go sit in the park and take notes before I do anything. Or they can be things that are very sort of like pragmatic, like, oh, I always do like a brainstorm list, or I always do like an elements and analytical point list, or I always do whatever it might be. So any tips and tricks that you guys have, methodologies that you have that really help the writing process, those would be great to hear about. But the idea here is also just for you to have this reflection so that you can think about, okay, next time I know I want to do this, or next time I'm not going to try and make this, fall in this trap or get stuck in this place. And we can therefore refine our writing process to make it more effective. Okay, let's turn to uh, our second module. Um, and forgive me, I'm going to turn on closed captioning here. I apologize for not doing that from the start. And YouTube has its own closed captioning system, I believe, that you can use as well. So, but I apologize for that, and I'll make sure it's on for the rest of this video. So our new module, of course, is called Iconoclast, and originally we were gonna think about subcultures. And Iconoclast, in some ways, is related to subcultures, which is to say, some sort of human. I was going to say sort of human group would be a subculture, right? But some sort of human, in this case with Iconoclast, that is having some sort of impact upon society or had some sort of impact on society in regards to a social issue. So it's not that much of a jump from subcultures. In fact, I think what it does is by focusing on a single person or maybe just a couple people, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, but by mainly focusing on just one person in terms of the influence or the social impact they're having upon a social issue or two, it makes things a little bit easier, right? As opposed to writing about an entire subculture that can get a little more complicated, requires quite a bit more research, actually. Not that we aren't going to use research in this module, we absolutely are. Research is going to be really important to discovering the various different things that your subculture does. So uh, I want to sort of give a little bit of context, as I usually do when it comes to any new topic. A lot of this that I'm going to do is going to be sort of more generalized context in terms of where did the idea for the topic come from? Um, what is it kind of connecting to in terms of how this is, relates to this idea of the larger concept of our class of thinking about our society and social issues in our society, and how our society works. And it really came from, I mean, it was October 5th, 2011, and I was teaching a writing class, actually, and I came to class, and there seemed to be, I mean, this was probably me projecting a little bit, but my class seemed to be a little bit sort of quiet or a little bit down. In particular, there were a few students who were sort of really seemed a little bit off or not themselves. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to ask these students in front of the rest of the class, what's going on? What's up with you guys? Da, 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 because I didn't want to put anybody on the spot or make anybody feel anxious, or even worse, make somebody talk about something they didn't want to talk about. Um, but so I just kind of moved on, and it just seemed like what it seemed like was that something had happened and I didn't know what it was. And it's clear what it was. It was Steve Jobs had passed away. Steve Jobs, of course, is the CEO and sort of the brain, if you will, the idea person behind Apple. Um, and so, again, I might have been projecting a little bit, but then we actually, the next day we had or it was a couple days later, we had a conversation in class as to what Steve Jobs meant to people. And a lot of people were talking about how that they really felt a sadness when Steve Jobs passed away. And this was sort of curious to me because Steve Jobs, I mean, none of these people had known Steve Jobs personally. Steve Jobs didn't, I mean, outside of making those kind of like Apple opening or Apple product introduction speeches, outside of a few commercials, Steve Jobs isn't really somebody who is directly in our lives, or was it directly in our lives. But he was obviously somebody who indirectly is very much a part of our lives, particularly if you own Apple products, right? So whether it's computers or iPhones, or back in those days it was iPods. We don't even think about iPods anymore because it's all encapsulated in the iPhone. But any kind of Apple product, any kind of laptop or iPad or whatever it might be, um, Steve Jobs in many ways it was emblematized in those kind of products and those things. So that in that way, Steve Jobs did have a kind of direct influence on us. And so I quickly noticed that there was kind of a memorial, and there still is a memorial that's going on. I was going to show it on screen, but in the spirit of time, I just took a quick screenshot. But it's a memorial that just runs progressively of messages that people posted in memoriam of Steve Jobs. Now we're talking about an event that happened almost 10 years ago, but right here's just like a clip, right? The man who changed the world would not have been the same without iPod, iPhone, or iPad, but none of these would have ever existed without I, Steve, RIP, Mr. Jobs, I pray. Steve Jobs had an influence around my life, inspired me by his achievements, his reputation for quality at all costs, and mantra of making things insanely great. I've been an example to many. I hope you'd be the first human to live forever. So there's a couple things sort of at work here. One is sort of that what this illustrates is that individuals often have, even individuals we don't know, if you want to say cultural icons, or I would say iconoclasts, have great power, right? And they have great influence upon our culture, our society, even ourselves, right? In fact, much of the way in which power can be wielded in terms of iconoclasts is that they sort of tap into our consciousness, our emotions. They tap into our sense of trying to be better than who we are. So, an example of this for our generation might be somebody like Kobe Bryant. So, it might seem silly that people were sad or upset or a little lost when it came to the loss of Steve Jobs, because this was, something that happened almost 10 years ago. But if you think back most recently to Kobe Bryant, even if you weren't a major fan of basketball, or even if you weren't a fan of Kobe Bryant, I think it took everybody by shock. I mean, it was obviously shocking the way he passed away, but and horrific that along with him, so many other people passed away, including one of his daughters. And so, there's a moment in which we feel like we've really lost something. And so I think the power of the individual is sort of represented in these things. And this is sort of part of the idea of where the idea for this assignment comes from, is thinking about the ways in which these individuals are so meaningful, or can be so meaningful and impactful in our lives and in our society. So let's talk about this context a little bit more concretely here in terms of a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. And these are questions, again, that I'm going to sort of answer these questions in part. This was actually, some of this came out of the discussion we had in our face-to-face session. But a couple of questions I wanted to ask in terms of why individuals wield such power in our current society is the first question. And then the second question is, what aspects of our current society serve to enhance the power of individuals? So questions are kind of overlapping. They're related, obviously. I mean, in terms of, generally, why is the individual so powerful? But what specific aspects of our society enable or empower individuals to be so influential? And so, one thing, I had a few answers here to this, and some of these are coming out of the face-to-face discussion. So they're not just my answers, but these are answers from our class. I mean, one thing is just to think about, as America, we have this kind of mythology or this ideology of individualism and exceptionalism. Herbert Hoover wrote a book famously called American Individualism. But even things like, we love our gangster figures. We love, one of the founding American figures is the sort of Wild West cowboy, right? This sort of individual figure, this individual rebel. Think of James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. It's a very American thing to be an individual and to be an exceptional individual. So when we think about American history, we often think about the great sort of, the founding fathers, or Martin Luther King Jr. or Steve Jobs, right, or Kobe Bryant, right? We think about these figures, these individual figures that really represent, in many ways, who we are. Another thing that I think gives the individual so much power is the increasingly secular society we live in. There's actually arguments now, and there's some studies now that we're sort of tacking back. 20th century was really considered to be a time when modernism took hold, And modernism, by that, what I mean is that people started living in cities. People, were less living out in sort of small tribal communities or farms or out in the countryside, and people started flocking to the cities, and we have the whole rise of mass culture, modern culture, and this led to many people's a secularization of society. I'm not saying the complete secularization of society or the complete loss of religion or religious faith or spirituality in society, but it was certainly something that helped, something that was sort of concomitant or a part of the rise of modern culture. And the reason I say this secular thing, why does that have to do with the individual, is that in many ways, and I'll talk about this in just a little bit in terms of our next slide, in many ways, our new gods become these, one way to look at it is our new gods become these icons. In other words, these icons take on this kind of almost spiritual power, or they have this almost, well, they have this iconic power. The word icon, as we will see, is closely related to a notion of the religious. Um, so another thing that I think empowers individuals is the rise of mass culture, mass media in our society, right? So the 60s really saw, the rise of mass culture and mass media in terms of television, radio, obviously, I think going on for a while. It's not that there wasn't television in the 50s, there was, but in terms of everybody having a television in their house, that really started taking hold in the 60s. And this meant sort of mass culture, which is that we're suddenly being exposed to ideas en masse, right? Which is to say that, everybody sees the new Tide commercial, right? Or whatever it might be at the time. Everybody knows this TV show, right? So, whether it's Leave It to Beaver or Happy Days or whatever the television show might be, there's this rise of mass culture. Now, how does that relate to a kind of sense of the individual? Well, it really meant the rise of celebrities, right? So celebrities, obviously, with mass media, become that they have their sort of platform and their stage to be for exposure, for attention, for following. So icons, cultural icons, really sort of start to take hold. Sure, in the 50s, no doubt you have celebrity culture then, and that's sort of the beginning rise of even things like Hollywood. But you also, just in terms of consumerism, right? You think about a lot of our icons today, they often have their own brands. So your Kim Kardashian, you have your own, forgive me, I don't know. She probably has her own clothing line. She might have her own jewelry. She might have her own perfume. She obviously is her own brand, Kim Kardashian. The Kardashian television show, Kim Kardashian herself is a brand. Kanye West, I mean, in the similar boat, right? And almost most celebrities have their own consumerist brand. So even somebody like we're going to talk about in a minute, somebody like LeBron James is associated obviously with the Lakers now, but associated with the NBA, which is its own consumerist market. And LeBron has his own products and clothing and gear, excuse me. So um, consumerism really adds into that, right? So, I mean, whether it's Ronald McDonald, now Ronald McDonald is not a real person and it wouldn't count as a sort of iconoclast focus, but it's very clear how consumerist culture is really is really connected to celebrity culture. So we often see celebrities selling us various products or becoming spokespeople for various products. So celebrities have come to play a major part in modern culture. It's sort of an obvious statement, but I think it's directly related to the way in which we can see the individuals gaining more and more power in our current society. Just a few more here. Another one is, and this is a little bit more recent, is the rise of social media. So before, with a celebrity, right, you'd read about your celebrity, your favorite celebrity in magazines. You'd read about your favorite celebrity, or see them on television commercials, see them in movies, whatever. Nowadays, we have almost a direct connection to celebrities, so to speak, in terms of social media. So you follow, so and so. You follow Michelle Obama on Instagram. Michelle Obama sends tweets out on Twitter. Michelle Obama does her own TikToks. I don't know that she does. I'm just making that up. But the idea is that social media sort of expands this idea of mass media and also makes it, well, I mean, I suppose more social, but it makes us feel like we have a little bit more of an intimate, or at least strengthens that connection that we feel between individuals in our society and ourselves, right? So I follow so and so on Instagram, and therefore I feel like I'm getting messages. I know they're not sent directly to me, obviously, but I feel like I'm sort of associated and affiliated or connected to that person even more clearly. If anything, I'm interacting or at least receiving communication and messages from that person. And this, of course, is not to accept the way in which social media helps various movements, right? So here we have, social media has empowered women to rewrite the rules. We have such movements like the Me Too movement or Time's Up, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter movement, of course, that really began as sort of social media movements, right? Hashtag movements, as we would call them. Um, so finally, or two more actually. One is wealth is power. So billionaires, elites, we live in a time where the wealth divide, I think, is bigger than it's ever been in our country's history. And this great wealth obviously gives people great power. So, I mean, in one example, you could look at, Donald Trump being somebody of great wealth, being somebody of celebrity, and therefore also holding one of the most powerful positions, if not the most powerful position or office in our country, right? And many would, you could say that his celebrity and his wealth got him that position, or helped, excuse me, to get him that position. But also just that wealth, if you have wealth, you have power in our society in terms of the way that you're able to access and control and influence various structures and be in the media, control the media, influence the media, in the way in which you have followers, and people who will listen to you, and you have influence. So that way in which wealth is so much more, you're not going to see. No longer are we living in sort of a rural area where everybody, is pretty much a working class or impoverished class. We're living in a society where certainly there's plenty of working class and impoverished class, but there's also this elite class that owns the majority of the wealth in the world, and they have this kind of spectacular influence upon our society. Finally, I think this is another thing that plays a role, is that we live in an era of high activism, right? This is, again, millennials are dead, long live the woke Gen Z. We obviously are seeing this more recently. I know Gen Z is perhaps even passe at this point. I mean, this is a headline from an article from 2 years ago. But right, the idea is that, in many ways, with Iconoclast specifically, we're looking towards individuals to help us think about the ways we can make a better world, right? And we can challenge the status quo to make a better world. So we live in this era of high activism, meaning there's a lot more people who are socially aware and socially conscious, and who are skeptical, I would say, or challenging the status quo, in hopes for a better future for themselves, but also really for their children, and so on and so forth. So there's this idea of social consciousness, that I think is really adding to individuals and giving them power. So now you have individuals who can be on platforms that tap into those social issues or those activist issues to help them gain a sort of power or a sort of sway. So what this sort of connects to, generally speaking, and I wanted just to open it, this is more just for kind of interest and curiosity, is two people that sort of reference these shifting tides of our culture. And one was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Now he's writing in 1882. This is from a book called The Gay Science. And he made this famous proclamation that God is dead, God remains dead. Now, this is a really controversial statement, and in no ways am I bringing this statement up to be sort of, anti-religious or anti-spiritual, or in fact, that's not what Friedrich Nietzsche was saying. If anything, he was saying the opposite. His concern was that with the rise of modern culture, that we're losing that kind of moral fabric, and that we're also seeing the rise of individuals as having undue power over people. So in other words, his concern was that we were losing our morality because we've lost upon our sort of agreed upon God and our agreed upon moral structure, if you will. So he says at the end of this, is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? He's saying, he's really thinking about the ways in which, we're talking about the start of the 20th century, or just about, and how there's all these icons and these authority figures who are rising to power, thinking particularly of sort of dictators, and authoritarian leaders, and how they seem to have this undue sway over people, even, and that has killed God, if you will, and God in quotes there. And then another person that's sort of talking about the rise of mass culture and mass media is Andy Warhol, in 1968. He, as part of an exposition, he had this line. It's not clear as to if he included it, but this quote is associated with him. It was an art exhibition of his work, and it said, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes." And this is kind of like the YouTube phenomenon, right? Or people going viral. But I just thought it was interesting in terms of the way in which he's sort of talking about the ways in which our modern culture, particularly now, and I mean, it's almost like he's predicting social media, is a way in which we can all sort of have exceptional influence, at least for 15 minutes, according to Andy Warhol, or that the individual has that much more potential to become a kind of icon or an iconoclast in that sense. So let's get a little bit more pragmatic about what is an iconoclast. What is meant by that? Well, I want to sort of differentiate ourselves just from the sort of straightforward definition of an iconoclast. Um, Originally, an iconoclast really meant as a destroyer of images of worship, right? Religious icons, or sort of any object like a crucifix, let's say, or a a vase with like the Virgin Mary on it, or something like this. An icon, a religious icon, is any kind of material symbol, of a religious symbol. And so, during various sort of holy wars, if you will, or religious rebellions, if you will, there would be people who would destroy these icons, right, as a way to, you know, threaten and challenge the sort of religious establishment, right? So, I mean, we're obviously moving away from that, in the sense of what we're using the word iconoclast for. We get a little bit closer to it with the first definition here when we say that a person who attacks cherished beliefs or institutions. Yeah, I think iconoclasts do that. Though they don't, I wouldn't say attack, might be a little bit strong of a word. So for our purposes here, and I'll get to that in just a second, there is an aspect of an iconoclast, I think, that is rebellious. And it doesn't have to be directly rebellious, but it is somebody, I think, who is doing something different. And I'll address that in a second. But for our purposes here, I think the definition of what an iconoclast is, it's a person who uses their social position to make a significant social impact through actions and creative and professional pursuits, right? So, or it should be and or professional pursuits. It doesn't have to be creative pursuits, but it's anybody who is trying to use their position and their status within a society or within a culture to have some sort of social impact, right? Now, why an asterisk there? And this goes to what I was saying about the iconoclast part of it, which is to say that most often iconoclasts challenge, they shake up the system. They challenge what is expected. They challenge the social norm. There's something about them that sort of opens up a new way of thinking about a particular social issue. So here you can see an image of Colin Kaepernick with his teammates taking a knee during the national anthem. And this, of course, created a huge controversy. Colin Kaepernick has been, I mean, there's a lot of debate about this, but he has not played in the NFL since, despite, I believe, taking the 49ers to a championship game right before the Super Bowl. So Colin Kaepernick has been sort of become the face of this very controversial move of taking a knee during the national anthem, and therefore many argue that he has been blackballed from the NFL because of this. That that owners have gotten together and agreed that they will not take Colin Kaepernick. This is back, I think, in 2014. That this, in the wake of the killing of Trayvon Martin, I believe. Um, and so, in sort of the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the reason I point this out is, as an example, is that in many ways what Colin Kaepernick did was he really upset a lot of people. And so he was clashing with social expectations and social norms. And of course now, ironically, there are professional leagues all around the globe who are even working it into their games to allow people to express their political viewpoints. For example, the Premier League, the soccer league in Britain, is they all the athletes take knees, or they have an option to take a knee before every game. And I think the same is actually happening in the NFL. You have the league now, and the NFL coming out and saying they were wrong, but they weren't going to say they were wrong until somebody actually made this move to try and challenge that sort of situation. Greta Thunberg, or Thunberg, excuse me, I'm mispronouncing at least once there. The young girl who sort of got up at a climate summit and sort of spoke directly to world leaders, and particularly to President Trump, about the way, since President Trump had removed us from the Paris Accord, and sort of had made this direct challenge to world leaders, to think about the future of our society, accusing them of being selfish. Sort of, and all at the age of, like, I think she was probably 12 years old, 13 years old when she first did this. Getting up in front of a global stage and sort of making, so really, as a young kid, this really broke the norm, right? Really challenged our expectations of what a 12-year-old can do, and has now become a kind of iconoclast activist for environmentalism. Uh, Sorry, I went through too quickly there, but at the top here, and this is where the sort of icon or logo, if for our module, is a painting by an artist named Banksy. There are no sort of like public pictures of Banksy. Banksy does his best to avoid, excuse me, Banksy does his best to avoid the sort of celebrity spotlight. And in many ways, his career and his artwork is political in the way that it sort of clashes with the sort of norms of the art world. Banksy has a real problem with the way that the art world is so focused around elites. In fact, most recently, or fairly recently, he created these sort of representational paintings. I'm not sure exactly what they were of, but put them in kind of these ornate frames, and they sold. I mean, he's a very famous artist at this point, due to the fact that he's been very sort of iconoclastic. And one of his paintings sold for millions of dollars, and he had actually built into the frames of these paintings a kind of canvas shredder. So as soon as this person spent all this money, right, and then got this painting in their house or put it in whatever museum, the painting destroyed itself. And in some sense, it's probably even more valuable now that it's that. But at the same time, he was making a comment, right, about the way in which the art world is so sort of ivory towered, right? It's so for the elite, right? And he wants to make art that's, most of his art takes place in the streets. He's a graffiti artist. So, for example, this image here, the flower thrower, is actually located on the sort of the wall between Israel and Palestine, and where obviously there's ongoing and continuing and historical conflict and tension, and he is sending a kind of message within that sort of political issue. Finally here, and now this is where I was saying that I want you to focus in on an individual, but if there's a situation where the individual is associated maybe with just like a couple other individuals, here you have a photo of Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Cullors. These three women are. I almost want you guys to guess who they are, but they are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, a couple of why are they iconoclasts? Well, obviously they've inspired an entire movement to resist the kind of social norm of racial injustice in our society. But there's also other ways in which they are. I mean, we're talking about three women. Women normally in our sort of patriarchal society are not supposed to be so abrasive or upset the social norm. They're not supposed to be so empowered, right? According to a patriarchal, ridiculous sort of sexist logic. And then not to boot, they're Black women, right? So we have these three Black women who are really standing up and have done a remarkable job in terms of challenging status quo and motivating people and motivating so many to challenge the status quo around the issue of social injustice and racism, and bias within our justice system. So in that sense, an iconoclast is kind of a rebel, right? There is something about them that is shaking things up. Now, they don't have to be hyper rebellious or hyper controversial in terms of whichever iconoclast you're thinking of, but you do want to think about the way in which they are sort of finding a new path or putting forward new ideas. So even somebody like Steve Jobs, I mean, I wouldn't say he was necessarily an iconoclast in the most dramatic sense, but he really did rethink, you know, how CEOs and companies can be. He also rethought technology. So there's something iconoclastic for sure about Steve Jobs as well. Lastly, once we identify, I mean, obviously in the needles in a haystack discussion board, we talked about two possible iconoclasts that we want to think about. But the next step, and this for our next discussion board, what we'll be doing is really doing a sort of doing some research to find more about whoever we're writing about, right? So that there's usually more to an iconoclast than what we know on the surface. So let's take an example like LeBron James. Now, most of us know LeBron James and who he is, and most of us know LeBron James in terms of his exploits within the NBA, right? One of the most storied and successful and impressive NBA players of all time. We all know that. Now, in terms of what LeBron James does beyond his profession as as a professional basketball player, um, uh, many people may know a little bit about that, but it's going to be important for me, whichever icon or iconoclast I'm writing about, to do research to understand more about the different ways that iconoclasts are involved, or my focus is involved in terms of trying to have an impact, right? In some cases, you might find like, oh, well, maybe there isn't that much to this person, right? Other than like maybe they just tweet a lot. That might not be enough to develop a full sort of analysis or an argument and analysis about. But so I did a little research into LeBron James. I mean, one thing we know is that, especially recently, LeBron James has been kind of an activist within the NBA. So this is actually after the murder of Trayvon Martin, when LeBron James, back in 2014, when LeBron James was playing for the Miami Heat, he kind of asked or inspired the rest of the Miami Heat squad to all wear hoodies. Trayvon Martin was wearing a black hoodie when he was murdered, and so it became this kind of symbol of the victimization and the killing of, in particular, young people of color, and the kind of the racial profiling. So the black hoodie, and so here we have an image of the Miami Heat wearing this in public at a public event. I think it might have even been before a game recently. So in many ways, and most recently, we've seen LeBron James wear, I Can't Breathe shirts, Black Lives Matter shirts. In fact, now the whole NBA is has installed kind of or allowing players to wear kind of political statements on their jerseys, should they choose to do so. Um, so that's one thing. Another thing is in 2014, LeBron James, along with Chris Paul, Carmelo Anthony, and Dwayne Wade, came out as the very first act, if you will, of the SBs. And I think this was 2014 again, as the very first sort of act of the SBs. They came out and gave a kind of political speech, a Black Lives Matter-esque speech about the importance of empathy, and the importance of understanding racial bias, of understanding racism, of racial sensitivity. And it was the very first thing that happened at the ESPYs. So an ESPY is normally a show that maybe isn't so political. Here in this case was sort of developed into a show where at least LeBron sort of spearheaded this moment where these professional players could come out and be a voice for social change, or voices for social change. Um, you may have heard recently, LeBron James, I think it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, LeBron James and his foundation, which I'll talk about in a second, opened up a school called, I think it's called the I Promise School. It's in Akron, Ohio, where LeBron James is originally from. And it's completely dedicated to giving kids, working class, lower class, and kids who are don't have equal opportunity, um, the opportunity for an education. And it's a beautifully built school that I'm sure costs millions upon millions of dollars to build. It's got really strong, involved faculty. It provides all the resources to give these kids an equal and equal opportunity and equal education. Um, and so I think it's actually going into something. It might actually be even older than that. I think it's going into maybe its fifth or sixth year, but it's a school in which for these kids in Akron, Ohio, to allow them to sort of to level the playing field, so to speak, when it comes to education. So the I Promise School. I just mentioned the LeBron James Family Foundation, and this is a foundation that was part of, sort of the umbrella organization that built the school, but he also does LeBron James Family Foundation also does a lot of work towards offering educational scholarships, millions upon millions of dollars of scholarships being offered to kids who don't have those equal opportunities. So the I Promise School is kind of like a focused version of this, but the LeBron James Foundation is global. It's something that operates, like I said, worldwide, and is thinking about leveling the playing field, social justice across the board when it comes to the education of kids without the kind of equal opportunities. LeBron James is also a producer. He most recently is a producer on the film, or it's a series called Self-Made. I haven't seen the series, but Self-Made, it's the story of Madam C.J. Walker. You can see there, who in the 1910s, the early 20th century, was the wealthiest black woman, or one of the wealthiest black women in society, and I'm sure there was very few of them due to all the discrimination at that time. And so it's sort of her story of being self-made, and kind of a story of empowerment, and a story of sort of black empowerment. And so LeBron James, again, as an iconoclast that he is putting his money behind these projects that are showing a kind of vision of empowerment of black people in our history, as a producer on that show. Lastly, and most recently, perhaps, is in the wake of all of the global protests for social justice and the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others. Um, um, and with the upcoming election, LeBron James and a few other professional basketball players, and then now some players from other sports have joined to create a foundation called More Than a Vote. And this is kind of their logo here, and it's really designed towards, one of the things they did is they encouraged NBA owners to open up the NBA stadiums to be voting or polling places for the next election, and primarily focusing in on getting people who are from neighborhoods where it's either very difficult to vote, or the polling places are shoddy or not well managed or put together. And this happens mostly in sort of ghettoized communities or marginalized communities, most often lower class, working class, and communities of color. And giving them, opening up these arenas for these massive polling places where people can come in and vote easily, and without having to deal with any of the kind of challenges of racial bias and sort of class bias that often plague our voting process. And the other thing they do is they actually educate people about voting, how to register to vote, when to vote, how do you actually vote, what to expect when you go in there, where your polling place and your polling location is, all that information that helps people vote. And so, in many ways, this foundation is working towards, again, this notion of social change and having some sort of social impact. So you can see, this is me doing research for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes in relation to LeBron James. And I just literally typed into Google LeBron James activism and found a few articles that listed, that talked about multiple things that he has done. Right. From there, I can look in the works cited of those articles and find more articles about it. And I can Google again, how LeBron James is affecting racism in our society, how LeBron James is right. So I'm also Googling in terms of the social issue maybe I'm thinking about, or how LeBron James is for social justice or whatever it might be. So in just this sort of quick research process, I've opened up my icon or my iconoclast into far more than just being a great NBA player, right? We have this idea of the multiple ways in which LeBron James is having an impact upon these social issues. And so you can see I could have different paragraphs. A paragraph about him, LeBron James is a producer, LeBron James in terms of education and the LeBron James Family Foundation, LeBron James in terms of getting people to vote, LeBron James as a kind of spokesperson, LeBron James as a kind of as a figure, as an activist professional athlete. So multiple sort of paragraphs, ostensibly, or subclaims that I could be thinking about in relation to the iconoclast. So that research is going to be key. We're going to be doing a discussion board post at the end of Friday night. That's all about focusing in on just one iconoclast figure and doing some research, right? Finding some articles about your iconoclast that allow you to think more thoroughly about what are all the things that that person is doing beyond what is commonly known that are shaping or influencing the social issue you see at stake. In some cases, you might look, like I said, you might look at your icon, do a little bit of research, your iconoclast, and do a little bit of research and realize, okay, there's not really a whole lot here. So maybe you want to switch. Maybe you want to think about somebody else who's maybe involved in different ways. But don't, it might not be as dramatic and varied as perhaps like with LeBron James here, but you can think about how different things, different small things, right? Like, giving a speech somewhere, writing a book. You can think about how some small things that maybe didn't get a whole bunch of attention, wearing a t-shirt that says I can't breathe, how these small things can be things that you could analyze in subclaims to make the point about how this person is having an impact. Okay, as a way to wrap this up, I want to take a look at our M2 overview. And I'm not going to read through this whole thing because that's something that we can do on our own time. But I do want to sort of, I sort of begin the way I began with when the M2 overview, I begin with the way I began in terms of talking about Steve Jobs and Apple and this idea of what an iconoclast is. And I mentioned Kobe Bryant and, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg as being two sort of iconoclasts that recently we lost. It doesn't mean that your iconoclast needs to be somebody famous. It doesn't mean that your iconoclast has to be somebody that is not alive anymore. They can be alive and very well active in what they're doing. I just did the whole thing about LeBron James. If you want to write about an iconoclast from history, that's fine, but we'll want to think about setting up the context of that time, that they really had an impact or an influence. So as I said, I kind of want to start here and then get to the prompt, and then we'll sign off. As is indicated by the moniker and opposed to icon only, an iconoclast is someone who goes against the grain and affects change by taking the path less taken or never even thought about. Iconoclasts are often controversial and often have their hands in a variety of fields and social spaces, living and working with an activist mentality where their efforts are dedicated to finding a better and different way than the ways that have normally been accepted or followed. So that sort of taps into what I was just getting at recently in terms of how an iconoclast often doesn't have to do something super controversial or completely against the social norm, but that is something that people is unforgettable, but in many ways is doing something that is going beyond themselves or like what a normal life or what the norm expects to make a change. An iconoclast motto, thus, might be best realized in quotes from two of the most powerful iconoclasts of human history. First, from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Be the change that you are trying to create." And then also from Jackie Robinson, that a life's importance is, or that a life is not important, excuse me, it's a typo there. A life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives. So here's our prompt for our second module, and this should sound relatively familiar. The process we're doing in terms of, after we analyzed our non-traditional narratives, the process that we're undertaking is very similar to thinking about what do you feel is like, what is the message of these different actions or different things that your icon does and or your iconoclast does, and what is the impact upon that in terms of larger social issue. So for our second module, M2 Iconoclast, we will select an iconoclast figure from history, recent memory, or our current time, and analyze how specific aspects, actions, or creations of your selected iconoclast have an impact on a social issue of their time, making an argument about what you see as the larger significance of that impact for society. So we have that larger significance. You have that language again. Now that we've been through that first module, you basically know how the rest of the modules are going to go. Um, so we're going to start with these discussion boards that are really about brainstorming for a focus. So needles in a haystack was really about that. Having a couple of foci in mind, just in case one doesn't work out. Then we're going to sort of get in a little with our next discussion board. We're going to get in a little bit more detail and use some research to think about our focused iconoclasts a little bit more, a little bit further. And then we're going to work our way towards developing sort of subclaims and a possible central claim, so on and so forth, then invention process, then the workshop draft, and so on and so forth. So we're writing the same thing: central claim driven, subclaim driven, argument and analysis. We're obviously just focusing instead on not a non-traditional narrative anymore, but now we're focusing in on an iconoclast figure. I provide a little more description about what an iconoclast is, though we discussed quite a bit of that in this video. And I also go and give you some lists about some iconoclasts or icons from history or the contemporary time. These lists are not complete, they're not perfect. They're just some sort of quick lists that if you're having a trouble thinking about what icon you want to write about or iconoclast you want to write about, they can give you some ideas. Please communicate with me if you have an idea that you feel like isn't on any of these lists, but you think actually fits the assignment. I'm open to hearing different ideas about different iconoclasts that you have in mind that maybe not as um, well known as some of these that are on these lists. And the other thing you can do is think about social issues. So if you're really interested in sort of animal rights, or you're really interested in environmentalism, let's say, or education, or whatever it might be, you can start searching for people or activists within those fields, or iconoclasts within those fields, or within fashion, within technology. How did Coco Chanel completely change fashion and also sort of really empower women with her fashion design? So those are things you can think about. I also list some here: Oprah to Dave Chappelle, LeBron James, Megan Rapinoe, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Malala Yousafzai to Greta Thunberg, Kanye West, Taylor Swift, Frida Kahlo, Banksy, just to name a very few. There's a bunch of iconoclast examples in these lists. All right, everybody. Hope that was useful in terms of contextualizing and reflecting on Module 1 first, but contextualizing and setting up our new module. And I look forward to the discussions. I look forward to the discussions of our iconoclasts as we go on. All right, take care.